C.S Lewis observed that you cannot take all luggage with you on all journeys. And that's out of the preface to The Great Divorce, but actually the rest of the quote, it kind of fits the moment that we're in right now, because to go with that was also, on one journey, even your right hand and your right eye may be among the things you have to leave behind. And the journey for many creative people, not just musicians, into, through and out of COVID has been a challenging one. And I think a lot of us have had to leave various things behind. Journey is a metaphor that's frequently encountered in conversations about work and career development. And people will talk about that journey in terms of landmarks or the roadblocks, setbacks, turning points, things that take their life's journey in a whole new direction. So given that we've come together to talk about musicians' livelihoods over the next couple of days, I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about how we might expand those metaphors. The journey for musicians is not actually just about those practicalities of where we're headed. It's also deeply emotional and psychological. So tonight I want to outline what the COVID-19 pandemic has meant for the less practical elements of many musical journeys, and explore what that might mean for the evolution of our conversations about what sustainable livelihoods in music look like. So let's talk first about luggage. I now live in Melbourne, which, if you don't know, is famous for its 4 seasons in one day weather. For any outing, I would usually bring an extra layer, umbrella, raincoat, maybe the sunscreen and a water bottle in case the temperature jumps up 10 degrees. The unpredictability of the weather here encourages one to be prepared for multiple weather situations. And you can see the picture there, Melbourne at 12 o'clock and then at 12:30. That actually does happen. And in our careers education and research, particularly over the past 2 decades, I think we've been focused on a similar kind of approach to our well-honed methods of teaching the art and craft of music performance. We've added an appreciation for musicians' need for many non-musical skills. We know that most musicians will be self-employed to some degree. We know musicians frequently have multiple job-holding patterns. We know that a vast array of non-musical skills, including high levels of initiative, are required. Entrepreneurial flair or enterprise, depending on the desired career pathway, is also important. Research on music careers has pointed out that coursework needs to be expanded to include non-musical skills. Education and coursework have incorporated content encouraging young musicians to think like small business owners, which might include recognising when and where self-commodification or networking is going to be needed, understanding that not all tasks involved in making a living in music are about making the work, and being prepared for a working life that will require juggling and a commitment to self-directed career management. Through this research, the normalisation of the fact that most musicians' careers require significant self-management has been incredibly important for helping musicians to be better prepared for the realities of operating in a gig economy. This is what we might think of as the 2-suitcase approach to navigating a music career. So you can see here our 2 suitcases. We have one for talent development and one for careers education. And as we've been preparing or packing for this journey, we've also snuck a few other things into the suitcase. I don't know if anyone does that when they're traveling. I always sneak things into my shoes, which include the need to be competitive, to be heard and to succeed, that it's important to say yes to every gig, especially in the early career, that being professional at all times, read not showing your vulnerability, is important, and that if you're serious about music, you are probably not in it for the money. To frame these conditions, we've done a lot of research and talking about the portfolio musician and the necessity of both a portfolio of skills and roles for employability and professional survival. Underlying both of these ideas, the challenges of talent development and of employability, are similar ideas about the importance of individual agency and the impact this agency has on potential professional opportunities. If you just work hard enough, for long enough, and in the right way, things might work out. For many musicians, even those realities sound tough, they offer some sense of certainty about what making a life in music might be like. Returning to my journey metaphor, these approaches are great for those trips or days where there's a sudden change in the weather or the flight is a bit delayed. There might be unexpected things along the way, but the destination remains the same. Enter 2020. And COVID-19 has highlighted what it's like for musicians when the journey is more or less completely derailed. It's kind of like that moment when you've arrived at the airport before or after the trip of a lifetime and you are really over the weight limit with your baggage, and you are either going to need another suitcase or you'll need to make some hard decisions about what you leave behind. And also all the flights to Paris have been cancelled and you've been told that the only place you can go is to some place you've never heard of before, and the flight is leaving in 20 minutes from a completely different terminal. Or maybe all the flights have been cancelled full stop and you have to stay where you are and just head back home. The feeling of unpredictability and uncertainty about whether you'll even be able to get anywhere near your intended destination is what I want to focus on tonight. The pandemic has really highlighted why it's so important that we now expand our metaphors, our research, our teaching, and our professional capital to cope with some particular macro level challenges. And these challenges are complexity, uncertainty, and precarity. Complexity is different to something being complicated, in that complexity is really when something is intricate and has many parts, but also that it is hard to understand. So the complexity of career development and navigating career self-management is very hard for people to understand, even when they're very skilled. And that's largely because of this idea of emergent outcomes. In complex systems, you have interactions and reactions and byproducts of these interactions at all different levels. So there are an infinite set of possible outcomes or possible futures, and it's very difficult for people to see a pattern in those things. Uncertainty comes with the territory of complexity. If we can't always predict what the outcomes are going to be, we start to become aware the fact that there are many unknowns, and these unknowns are environmental in that they're sort of unknowns that everyone might be subject to at one point or another, but they're also it also stimulates uncertainty around process, which is an individual sense of whether we feel like we know how to react or respond when we're in a situation that's unfamiliar. That in turn impacts how we understand and interpret career events and career development. And there are theories that have been developed in the careers field that specifically talk to those particular challenges, two of the most prominent being chaos theory of Pryor and Wright, and Crumbolt's happenstance learning theory. And then we have precarity, and precarity shapes the nature of the work itself and specific working conditions. Because musicians aren't really just gig economy workers anymore. Their work patterns also meet the definition of precarious work. And in the last few years, research in the field of music has started to acknowledge that precarity. Pre-pandemic, precarity was defined in terms of employment uncertainty, temporary work, self-employed sole trader status, and multiple job portfolios. Interestingly, one of Canham and Bennett's findings from a large qualitative study published in 2017, which included a survey, suggested that many participants were still talking about the desire for more business skills content at the training level. But the challenge with precarity and precarious work is that it isn't something that you can really outrun by upskilling. And precarity can actually make any sort of work-life balance very difficult and lead to burnout, because more work doesn't necessarily equal less precarity. So the first idea I want to sort of put to you tonight is this: preparing musicians for work in music through talent development and enterprise training is no longer going to be enough, because work in music is perhaps not the same destination that it used to be. An additional challenge of the pandemic is that it's not unfolding in the same way at the same pace everywhere. Part of responding to the challenges of COVID and for COVID recovery, therefore, includes preparing musicians for an even wider range of destinations, not just the music professions, but the broader context in which they'll make their livelihoods, where their working conditions are characterised by complexity and its byproducts, precarity and uncertainty. A shift of focus is needed so that we move beyond intellectualising precarity to better understanding its psychological and emotional impact. What we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic is actually that the definition of precarity and the experience of precarity is changing. And that's indicative of the post-normal time that we live in and also the expanding complexity of our lives. But rather than thinking about precarity as a particular set of working conditions that can be managed through upskilling or diversifying the portfolio of work or simply moving on, what we're now seeing is precarity being experienced as a state of being, characterised by intense uncertainty, loss, disruption and anxiety. There are some other really important points about this shift. The experience of precarity is no longer exclusive to disadvantage. So you can, on the face of it or on the surface of it, have a full-time job and it can look good from the outside. Precarity is no longer just limited to some of those specific things about work conditions. It's different because it now has macro level and psychological causes and impacts. And the key takeaway for us in this shift to post-normal precarity, if you want to call it that, is that from a macro level perspective, precarity is really shaping sectors and fields and what they're going to look like in the years to come, because it's deeply affecting people at a psychological level. David Bluestein describes people's growing awareness of these shifts and their implications as a new critical consciousness about work and its impact on their lives. In music, precarity is also potentially locking out or knocking out a lot of professional capital, not because people are not talented enough to be in the field or they don't do enough networking, but because they don't have the psychological tools they need to tolerate the personal impact of precarious work. Which raises a question to consider over the next couple of days. What is needed to truly recognise the extent of the psychological impact of precarious work on musicians? And how could we make things better? There are signs that things are already moving in this direction, but an idea to sit with over the next couple of days is how we might support and nurture approaches that directly help musicians to deal with precarity. And to be explicit about what I mean here, I mean considering how the work we do makes a difference to the musicians on the ground who really need the help. So with all of this in mind and thinking about those challenges as part of a growing need for empathy, it's worth considering whether our teaching and research narratives around career building should be framed in quite the same way as we keep navigating COVID and emerge out the other side. Due to its nature, precarity is being experienced by many at the moment in a way that's not an immediate fit with positive psychology approaches to career development. Too much stress and competition creates learning problems. While it can be helpful to put a positive spin on the benefits, for example, of drawing on entrepreneurship or enterprise for one's career development, even if we know not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur, we probably can't and shouldn't take the same approach with precarity. We know that musicians are a high-risk problem for anxiety, depression and suicide. So it's important to tread carefully here and to recognise that just as it's been observed in the vocational psychology field, people's needs have really shifted. So attempting to put a positive spin on psychologically challenging conditions that many are not equipped to handle is not what we need for COVID recovery. And it's important to acknowledge at the same time the emotional impact that the pandemic has had for many musicians. In the career counselling field, researchers are now beginning to highlight the need for trauma-informed approaches as a way of responding to people's work-related loss due to the pandemic. Job loss or change during the pandemic should not only be thought of as a loss of income. It may also represent an increase in stress, social isolation, rapid adaptation, exhaustion, burnout, and psychological distress. So just for a little straw poll, and I can't see everyone, but I'm wondering, could you do a little smiley face or a thumbs up in the chat if you know someone who's lost their job or experienced a significant loss of income, quit their job, or left the field of music due to the pandemic? I'm looking to see, has anyone, if you just use your emojis, I can see a couple of people. Anyone else? Yes, sad face, yep. Looks like a lot of people, quite a few of you haven't. Well, you're lucky. I know of quite a few. So partly though, that illustrates my point that the effects of the pandemic are uneven. Some people may have come through it thinking, great, everything fine, even better. Others, not so much. But I think what we do need are approaches that reflect awareness of the emotional challenges of the present conditions, even if we're not experiencing them, together with appropriate interventions, because musicians were already experiencing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression at elevated levels in the US, UK, Europe, and Australia before the pandemic. Approaches that might include preventative strategies and tailored individual support in order to help musicians navigate the music professions and cope with precarity are probably what we need now. Or other options are that we might consider how we develop the findings of our research into practical workshops or models that can be recorded or shared or taught by others, so that the great work that's already happening can be of benefit to as many musicians as possible. These approaches consider how we work with what we already know and what we already have. And this brings me to, I guess, the second question that I wanted to put forward tonight. If precarity has now shifted from limited work-related choices to a state of being, what might we leave behind or do differently in response to that shift? What would a more integrated approach to talent development, career self-management, and precarity look like? Because a lot of what we've been focusing on, whilst it's really important, isn't the biggest issue anymore. Precarity is the challenge. And if musicians don't have the skills they need to tolerate this new kind of precarity that Bluestein and colleagues have identified, that's not just about disadvantage or only having part-time jobs, it's actually a state of being, then musicians won't have what they need for sustainable lives in music. Vocational psychology has many answers for us. Humanistic psychology does as well. You can see here, this is a model that I've developed for musicians' career learning, and the first step in the model is congruence. Congruence is a concept of Carl Rogers, which says that people need genuineness, acceptance, and empathy to grow. And I think that this particular moment in time is a time of considerable change and disruption for music, but it's also a time with tremendous potential for growth. And I think it's worth considering the centrality of the idea of congruence for growth, not just of individuals, but also collectively and for our sector as a whole. But I think maybe even before that, the first and most important place to start is accepting and being honest, especially if we're teaching or coaching, that we don't have all the answers. It's certainly a theme that's coming up a lot in vocational psychology in the careers field, that we have clients who don't know what's going to happen next, and we don't know what's going to happen for them either. And sitting with that uncertainty is something that we need to learn how to manage and to model if we're going to actually help other people. We're working in a liminal space right now, and many of the people that we work with are in that space too. So along those lines, I'm just going to wonder aloud and question whether that maybe changes the kinds of relationships that we need to cultivate with each other. Is it time to do different types of research? Do we need to take a stronger turn towards the career development field? Is it time to incorporate a wider range of research methods in what we do? Or have different conversations with our musician colleagues after gigs What difference would a stronger focus on action and applied research make for musicians on the ground? Because it's one thing to study the complexities of career development at arm's length from one's own life, and a very different matter entirely to be in the middle of all that complexity, precarity, uncertainty, and change, trying to work out how you will navigate it all on your own. And in my view, that is the biggest challenge of the present moment. So thinking about the challenges of the individual, I want to just reflect for a moment on how we process or respond to other people's experiences of difficulty during this time. My own recent research highlights how wide the bandwidth of that experience actually is. I've heard that the pandemic and lockdowns have provided much needed time for reflection and the opportunity to move in really positive new directions. I've similarly heard of the personally devastating impacts of isolation, the financial impacts of the rapid cancellation of more than a year's worth of future work in a matter of hours, and the feelings of demoralisation that come as early career artists contemplate starting from square one yet again. Almost across the board in my research, participants have observed that work in music is not well understood by those outside the field, which raises another question. What support or collective understanding do we provide within our field? It's very easy to look beyond and observe that if non-musicians understood us better, then everything would be okay. But we also need to pay close attention to the conversations going on within our field. How do we listen to each other, empathise with and make space for the impact of these very contrasting experiences and responses to the present conditions? And how many of our own practices feed into the experience of precarity as a state of being, rather than provide an antidote to it? What is the scope of the choices we're offering for the next generation of musicians in particular? To answer that question, I think we need to take a person-centred approach to understanding and addressing precarity, rather than an industry, academic, or education sector informed approach. Many of us have an insider's view of the problem, and we might need to put that to one side in order to help others imagine viable alternatives. Research and practice in vocational psychology, or career counselling, if you like, helps us to understand the value of the person-centred approach, and also why the situation for many musicians has become unmanageably complex and psychologically so challenging. If our focus is on getting into the industry, it's very tempting to offer suggestions, advice, or guidance about specific skills or knowledge, or to retrospectively want to understand how certain things might have been achieved by successful performers. But how much of that is going to be useful to a young artist who is trying to build their career today in quite different conditions? What will get people through the types of challenges I've outlined is a deeper connection to their own capacities and power. This is both a process, but also a particular way of framing experience in which congruence is key. From a vocational psychology perspective, the individual is the expert of the problem or challenge. So rather than providing more guidance, in a counselling setting, the career counsellor would be holding space for the individual and allowing them to articulate the challenge as they see it, to identify their strengths and areas of potential growth or change. There are obviously interventions that help with different aspects of enhancing self-awareness or with the process of building new skills if required, but essentially the counselling process is actually about listening and holding space for another person to work out what the issue is for them and what they need. When it's done effectively, it's incredibly energising and empowering. But congruence is really only possible through unconditional positive regard. And what unconditional positive regard brings to our conversations is an acceptance that other people are doing the best they can. The ethos behind this approach, non-judgment, however, is very different to the competitiveness of many of our work and learning environments, which don't always cultivate the space and empowerment I've just talked about. The problem is not that people no longer need advice or guidance about how to get noticed or play faster or get more traffic to their website. All those things are still important and will be concerns at various times, but there's still problems of how we compete with each other. Musicians during COVID have experienced an altogether different sort of problem, which is less about competition amongst ourselves and more concerned with the impact of a hugely disruptive health crisis, and also a gross lack of understanding about their work and why it matters. Which brings us to the theme of acceptance. You might have seen this British government advertising campaign. Here it's annotated, pointing out all the work that artists do, that presented a view of adaptation in which changing fields was promoted. In the career development literature, we could refer to it as reskilling. The issue this image raises for artists is that the problem's not presented here as a challenge of how to be more competitive, which we're already familiar with, or how to stand out in a competitive field, also familiar. It highlights the loss not just of work, but also of a possible future in the arts. The lack of empathy for the artists depicted through this campaign triggered a response that's possibly been even more traumatic than any initial cancellations might have been. And this is one of those macro level challenges that musicians are facing in many places of the world, as we see artists being increasingly marginalised at the policy level. Broader understanding of and acceptance of the value of the work of the artist and the work that they do is greatly, greatly needed. So, 3 key challenges, as I see it, are the impact of precarity has become something that requires new levels of understanding and attention. It can't just be 1 or 2 sentences in the introduction to the paper that says that that's the conditions, because precarity now as a context is actually affecting everything. It's not just the type of work we do, it's how we feel about it, it's how many hours we work, it's where our boundaries lie, it's a whole lot of things. And it also affects people's capacity to learn, their executive function, and their ability to access the core career development competencies that they need. Following on from that, are there different roles and responsibilities now for those of us who want to do something to help? How do we minimise the negative impacts of precarity on individual artists? Because those negative impacts, especially the emotional and psychological ones, can undo all the other good work that is being done. And finally, how do we make our work and learning environments supportive enough that there's enough time and mental energy left to tackle some of the larger narratives that reflect a marginalisation and devaluation of what artists contribute to society? Some peak bodies advocating where they can isn't really the groundswell of grassroots advocacy and activism that's needed to address what is a very significant and complex problem in our field. So I want to leave you with one final question tonight, and you can even, if you've got an answer or an idea, you can even put it in the chat if you want. And we often use this approach in career counselling settings, and it's called the miracle question. It comes from solutions-focused brief therapy, which was developed by Steve DeShazer. So here it is. Let's assume that these problems, these challenges I've been referring to, and the challenges and problems that you see where you are, have been solved. What would be different for you? And what would be different for the people around you? I hope that these 2 nights of ideas and discussion offer some insights into what might move us into really positive, new possible futures, and that you're inspired to action that might help others move in that direction too. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicole. That's fabulous. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Do we have any questions? Well, first off, congratulations. That was a fantastic and insightful keynote. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole? So we have, and you are welcome to unmic yourself. We have 10 minutes of questions if you would like to.
Yes, Nicole, hello and thank you. Nicole, in your book you talk a lot about strengths, and you mentioned it tonight in this in your talk. And strengths are something that are discussed a lot in positive mindset and working with performers who need some guidance in in that mindset area. You know, whether that be in terms of gratitude, or whether it be in terms of well-being, or whether it be in terms of, you know, the opposite, weaknesses. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about from a careers counsellor point of view, about the concept of strength and how you develop that in people.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's a really great question, and it's really interesting. And the starting point is actually with congruence. One of the frameworks that I really like, that I think is very applicable for musicians, is because we know that everyone's at some point going to have to change their plans or go down a different track. And so Richard Boyatzis has this wonderful theory called intentional change theory, and it's really based around, you know, how do people achieve their dreams? And so anything to do with strengths, I think we need to start off with that initial feeling of congruence. What is it that the person really kind of envisions for themselves, and give them an opportunity to articulate that. And then that opens a discussion around, okay, so if this is the future that you want and you want to be moving towards it, we can go back and look, all right, where are we today? So in that choice model, that's where humility is actually the starting point for strengths, because we can look and see, well, where are we now and what would it take to get to the next goal? Interestingly, some research that I'm working on just right at this moment, I'm doing quite a bit of work with hope action theory right now. And what we're seeing in the research on that is that at the moment, in terms of career competency strengths, a lot of energy is going into adaptation, self-reflection, and self-clarity. And what's happening is the scores for goal setting and planning, implementation, visioning, and hope are going down. So all the energy's on, I've just got to adapt, I've got to reflect, I've got to work out what I've got to do for the next stage of adaptation. And the visioning is sort of taking a backseat, and the implementing, because it's hard to know what the future is going to be working towards. So one of the things you can do from a strengths point of view, when we can't sort of say, okay, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, so therefore I need to really deliberately develop a very specific strength, is a really great question to just open a conversation and help a person see their own strength, is to say, wow, so how have you been coping? Because that how have you been coping in terms of, well, what has allowed you to show up and keep practicing despite the conditions, or get on the stage even if you are really nervous? How have you been managing that? So really powerful question for a person to then shine a bit of the light back on themselves and think, oh, well, I guess I've been doing this, or I've been reminding myself of that. And that will start to help people see, especially for these conditions, I suppose, the strength of their own resilience or their own capacity to keep on going.
Thank you.
Wonderful, great response. Would anyone else like to ask a question? You're more than welcome to jump on the microphone. I'm hearing. Yes, we have Pam. Hello, Pam.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I just half completed the question, so I'll. It says ... So here's the ... First of all, thank you so much. It was really excellent, inspiring, and it resonates. So I think globally, Nicole. Thank you. Love your book. It's so timely and just great to read, and building on fantastic work. I mean, we are in a period of precarity. You know, the precarity of work is one thing. The precarity of sustaining the earth is another. You know, it's a global phenomenon right across all employment, given that it was in 2013, you know, pre-COVID, that Carl Frey said 60% of future occupations have yet to be developed. And then he went on to say 40% of 5-year-olds will need to be self-employed for income. And you know, this, so we're not in a new space, except we are. You know, we are so connected and in really a, you know, sharing the uncertainty and these the moving between uncertainty and kind of less certainty. They're just, nothing is certain, if it ever was. So what are we learning from other careers, from other sectors, other than music industries or creative industries? So I'm looking across literatures, the big, you know, other literatures other than music industries, kind of really doing some, leading the way in terms of thinking differently about this issue of work, precarious work.
Yeah, well, I mean, David Bluestein is doing some really amazing work in the US, and his team have been studying precarity for a long time. But along with that, they've also looked at the psychology of working theory and this idea of decent work as a human right. So, and also the notion that everyone should be able to find some sense of meaning and purpose in their work, which I think that's an idea we can bring into the field of music and reframe notions of success. I know that subjective successes come more to the fore, but very often it's actually other referent subjective success. It's sort of subjective success where you compare yourself to other people. And I might think, oh yeah, I'm into subjective success, but how many gigs has Di got and how many gigs have I got? And I don't have as many as her, so maybe I'm not happening anymore. So it's that kind, you know, it's trying to work out how we get out from under that and get away from that, and because then it really does have to be a vision of one's future. I think we're also getting this from the Mark Savika's work on life design, where people are designing a life that has work in it. And what's really unfamiliar for musicians is that very often it's not how we think about it. You know, music is such a huge, being a musician is such a big part of the identity. I mean, this is the first year in my life where I actually thought maybe I need a hobby. I've never had any hobby other than music. I've never wanted any hobby other than music. All my friends are musicians, you know. And then this year I just, with, you know, so much time, winning the world record for the amount of days in lockdown in Melbourne, 267 of them, I thought, I think I'm going to need a hobby that's not eating chocolate or drinking wine. So, yeah, you feel me, Pam. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting work in the life designing space, psychology of working theory, but I also think that this new work on expanding precarity and the critical consciousness, people's growing realization of just how unfair life is and it's not their fault, is very important. And some of the research I've been doing with musicians would suggest that musicians are also following this critical consciousness pattern.
Thank you so much. Could you put the names of those authors in the chat so I've got the spelling correct? Thanks so much.
Totally will do.
Good on you, Pam. Fantastic question and great response, Nicole. I especially like the bit about the drinking wine and chocolate, I think.
Yeah, don't judge me. I just talked to you for half an hour about empathy.
This is a very safe environment, and I can tell you, you've got a person that's got a good hobby right there with you.
Just delete that bit. That bit doesn't go on YouTube, okay?
That's fine. We'll put some lovely, delightful music in that now. We've got a question from Lottie and also from Karen, so I'll read out. Lottie, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly too, by the way. There is a certain inability of music students to conceive of what they wish for their creative career to look like after graduation, even when a decision is necessary. Do you have suggestions for how to help them conceive and design what their creative career will look like before they graduate?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you so much. Yes, I do. I am so lucky at Monash. I coordinate a unit that's about preparing musicians for life after graduation. And one of the things that I get them to do is to do a vision of their life in 7 to 10 years. I can't tell you how much the students complain because I am making them think of their life in 7 years' time. And they will come to me and say, Nicole, even 3 months is a very long time. This is the hardest assignment anyone has ever given me. But within that, you've got a few options. I mean, the reason for doing the visioning is what I get students to do is write. You can do it in a whole sort of different ways. We imagine, we do a little funny exercise in the first or second class where I say, imagine this is actually the reunion of this class, 5 years have gone by, and now introduce yourself saying what you want to be doing in 5 years, but talk about it as if it's already happened. So, it's the power of language. So one option is to actually get students to imagine. You can also get them to we do vision boards, we do vision playlist. You can even have a playlist of artists that you're aiming for. But then once you've got that vision, you start to work backwards, and we get students to think about it. It works well, I think, if you do it through a course, a period of coursework where you're introducing different concepts or ideas of what the industry might look like. So as they go, there's some breadcrumbs along the way to say, oh, I could see how I could get this opportunity if I got a grant, or I networked with this person, or I moved here, or I went there. But also when I do that is I get students to actually think about not just what they want, but also what they need. And that's other questions. That's like, do you need to live near your family? Do you need to live by the ocean? Do you need money? Do you need a regular paycheck? Do you want to walk everywhere and have a community garden? All those kinds of things. So it's also part of that space, I think, is actually just inviting students to say, no one's going to think you're less of a musician if you actually want to have a happy whole life. Because I think sometimes too, with that planning of the future, we plan to do things that we think are going to be impressive, or are going to build the CV and open all the right doors. But, we also actually, we have more responsibility than ever, thinking about all those great points that Pam raised about these different levels of precarity. We have a greater responsibility than ever to just actually make sure that we don't go crazy. So actually just giving ourselves what we need so we can be psychologically healthy to show up. This changes every aspect of our lives. So I think that's important too. I don't know if that really sort of answers all the question, but I've got my email address there, so happy to chat further.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicole. That's great. We're technically in our 10-minute break time, but we will give Karen her question, because she's been patiently waiting with her hand up. Your arm must be sore. So we'll do that very quickly. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you very much. It's not really a question, actually more of a comment. First of all, thank you so much, Nicole, for your very compassionate and empathetic presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm a freelancer, but I have a background as a senior lecturer where I had full-time work for a number of years. Came back just before COVID, a year or so before. Was just trying to pick up, and then COVID hit and so on. So I wanted to just mention, how can universities help? When I've asked for help, I've been given help, even including recently. And I just wanted to mention that I think the whole community that the university is associated with, including alumni, are important, or they should be important. And it's interesting, during those really dark, difficult times over the last couple of years, the universities that I've been involved with, a couple, one I've graduated from fairly recently, they kept writing to me and asking me for money and, donations to the university and so on, and mentoring and all this kind of stuff. I'm thinking, wow, me mentoring, I'm on Centrelink and struggling to survive and so on. A lot of what you're saying is very consistent with a recent course that I did for mental first aid, and asking how you're going. So I just wanted to make the comment, one of the things that would have been good to have from the university is just for them to acknowledge what their alumni were going through as well. And are you okay? How can we help? Maybe there were ways of just reaching out, not necessarily giving us jobs, but just to say, are you going okay? We're aware that that things are difficult at the moment. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a really important point, Karen. And I think one of the things that my students most appreciated in this last semester was I just did a little survey to check in with them and see how they were going. And the number of emails I got from students saying, thank you for caring about me. I was really quite gobsmacked at how much they really needed that, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
Thank you.
brilliant. No, great question, Karen, and I think it's a really good, definitely a good point. You know, just an email saying, "Are you okay?"
Exactly.
It opens up so much. So no, look. Well, we're off to a rip-roaring start. Thank you so much, Nicole. That was just incredibly insightful. I'm so glad we recorded that. That's fantastic. And yes, there'll be pleasant music going through the red wine and chocolate element of it. Not a problem at all.